breaking news. All right, breaking news. We're going to show you how Diddy's lawyer clapped back at the defense's case, but we're going to do a rundown when everybody else will do it. Then I wanted to come in and do it so y'all could get the real. Now, sit back, enjoy the ride, and know that they're going to break down everything as far as all the evidence that they felt acquitted Diddy of violating the RICO charge. All right. You know what it is. Unique Mecca Audio, man. We here. We're going to break this down. We got Jesse Weber with us. You already know he one of the best that ever done it. So we're going to run it back to Jesse Weber. We're going to get Jesse Weber to, break this thing down. All right.
Before deliberations, their final summation of the evidence and testimony in this case, trying to argue that Sean Diddy Combs should be found not guilty of racketeering conspiracy, not guilty of sex trafficking of Cassie Ventura Fine and Jane, and not guilty of transportation to engage in prostitution. Now, the closing argument was delivered by Sean Combs' main defense attorney, Mark Agnifilo. Now, remember, this comes after the prosecution delivered their closing argument yesterday. Prosecutor Christy Slavic. She highlighted how Combs operated a criminal enterprise, that the assistants, the bodyguards, they facilitated the crimes, they covered them up, they knew what was going on. She methodically went through each and every one of the underlying predicate crimes for racketeering conspiracy. They have to prove at least two: bribery, arson, kidnapping, drug offenses, forced labor. Again, you only need two. Then there was the sex trafficking of Jane.
Remember, you need to be unanimous and specific as far as which two, because the predicates are elements of the RICO. Per Richardson, or should I say U.S. versus Richardson, you have to be unanimous.
And Cassie, it was a very strong moment yesterday to say, look, not every sexual incident is sex trafficking. And just because a victim may consent one time or two times, that doesn't mean they consent all the time. You just need one instance of sex trafficking for Sean Combs to be found guilty of it.
All right, stop. And if they find that one, right? Now, there was multiple that they testified to. But now all 12 jurors have to pick the same ones. All 12. If 11 pick this incident and one pick a different incident, he's acquitted of the charge. That's how simple and easy it is. That's why all the defense need to do now is hone in on what they intend to prove and make sure they list it on the verdict form, so that, like I read in the Richardson versus United States case, they have to go back and deliberate on a unanimity portion of it.
And they provided, and Slavic provided multiple concrete, specific examples with respect to each victim that the jury can choose from. Transportation to engage in prostitution, literally transporting men and these alleged victims for the...
Now, how many men and how many different times you heard them say that they went from here to there? They can't just say, yeah, they transported John Doe and Kenny Sue. No, they have to say when, where, and what incident, because that's a predicate, which is an element of the RICO, which warrants a unanimous verdict. End of story. Let's keep this moving.
The purposes of sex work, through the credit card statements, travel records, text messages, voice notes. The argument was they directly tied Combs to paying and arranging the transport of the victims and men for the purposes of sex work. So, what did the defense say in response today? By the way, we also heard from the prosecution in their rebuttal closing too. Very short, but arguably impactful as well. Okay, so for that and more, let me bring in once again Law and Crimes in-court reporter Elizabeth Milner, who was inside that courtroom for all of the closing arguments from both, again, Mark Agnifilo, the defense attorney, and we also heard from Maureen Comey, the main prosecutor in this case, delivering the rebuttal. We'll get to that in a minute. Elizabeth, great to see you. Let's talk about Mark Agnifilo. So how did he start off, right? It seems like he started off basically by saying, this is not what the prosecution wants you to believe, right? There's no sex trafficking here. And it seemed like he really focused on the idea of text messages as evidence and really said this wasn't a federal crime, took aim at both Cassie and Jane. What were some of the opening remarks that stood out to you about this?
Yeah, well, a lot of parts of this closing argument really stood out to me, specifically the way that Mark Agnifilo's tone was to the jury and pretty much their final message to the jury before they eventually go and deliberate, which it looks like that will now start on Monday. But in terms of just him approaching the jury, he was very personable, really kind of pulling out that Mark Agnifilo charm. Like literally one of the first lines he said in his closing argument was, "This is a tale of two trials. The first trial is about witnesses and videos, and texts and evidence." He said the second trial was just kind of the word of mouth by the prosecutors. He was saying that this case is badly exaggerated. He says it's made up, in other words. He also said it's about personal use of drugs, nothing else. The evidence shows that it was kind of a swinger type of lifestyle that, you know, as far as the hotel nights and freak-offs occurred, or as Jane and Cassie had testified about the hotel nights and freak-offs, that these were just threesomes. It was just swingers. It was just an alternative lifestyle, those types of things. And then he was saying that the evidence shows that Sean Combs is a self-made, successful Black entrepreneur. He's done something that's hard to do, and that's have wonderful, successful, legitimate businesses. He says how many government witnesses said that they were moved by Sean Combs, that being with him was like drinking from a fire hose. He taught me great work ethic. And he admitted, he was like, did they always like him? Did the assistants always like him? Did his staff always like him? No way. That wasn't always the case, but they loved him. And then they kind of brought it back to Mia a little bit, where Mia had implied that she felt like she wanted to self-harm, mainly because she had lost her position over at Combs Enterprises, which is not to be confused with the criminal enterprise that the government is alleging. But in terms of just everything, including Derek Ferguson, who had also testified, he was the former chief financial officer over at Bad Boy. He was kind of saying things like he's a handsome Black man, and the reason that he wanted to work at Bad Boy was because he being Sean Combs was giving people who look like him opportunities that people of color may have not gotten elsewhere. And so even he made kind of one line that I thought was interesting, where he said diversity, equity, and inclusion. He was doing that. He, again, being Sean Combs, was doing that in his early 20s, as early as at 24 years old. And he says that the government says his businesses are racketeering, but then the defense pointed out that none of the witnesses says that they were a part of a racketeering enterprise. None of the witnesses got on the stand and said, yes, I'm a part of this racketeering conspiracy. He said none of that. And so it really was a pretty strong opening just in the first few lines, first few minutes of the defense's closing argument.
So look, I know our content can be a lot at times, sometimes.
Yeah, so, you know, that's where we at. She's breaking down everything that happened as far as with Diddy for the closing statement, so you could get a good idea of what went on with that, you know? So, you know, we there and we here.
Or let's go towards now the end of his closing, because that's the top charge. That's the one that carries life in prison. What did he argue why this is not racketeering conspiracy? Why there's no criminal enterprise or criminal agreement? What did he say?
Yeah, so he said a lot about racketeering conspiracy and emphasizing that it's a racketeering conspiracy, not just racketeering just alone in itself. And so Mark Agnifilo was talking about the whole common purpose of the enterprise members and how the defense was mentioning that Sean Combs was charged by himself. No one in the courtroom had testified again that they were a part of a criminal enterprise, that they were even doing acts that were considered to be crimes, and that he was saying, he being Mark Agnifilo, was saying that there is a gaping lack of evidence. He says that he was trying to do this enterprise by what? Having sex with his girlfriends. And so then when they go into the RICO conspiracy, the defense is saying that he's not charged again with racketeering, but racketeering conspiracy. He points out that the government never called a co-conspirator to testify. And let me just say this, Jesse, one of the alleged co-conspirators was actually inside the courtroom, and that being Fahim Muhammad, one of Diddy's security guards. And I think that was kind of interesting that they had brought him kind of on the defense's closing, but also that he's one of the alleged co-conspirators. He was inside that courtroom listening to the closing argument. I was thinking at points if his name was, you know, said out loud by either the prosecution or the defense, that he would maybe like do this. And it was really none of that. But in terms of just KK and her role, again, KK being Christina Cora, Mark Agnifilo said everyone needs a KK. And I thought that was interesting because I looked over in Sean Combs' direction when that specific line was said, and Diddy was nodding at that point, where again, Mark Agnifilo is saying everyone needs a KK because she's the right-hand woman to Sean Combs. Anything that he needed, he got for her, but not in a criminal type of way. And so the defense also pointed out a specific incident involving Carrie Morgan and Cassie Ventura Fine, where Diddy had brought allegedly a hammer over to Cassie's apartment. And so the defense was pointing out that instead of, calling the police or anything like that, that Carrie Morgan and Cassie Ventura, now Fine, they reached out to Christina Quorum. They reached out to D-Rock. And then Mark Agnifilo says, did anyone say that KK or D-Rock was a co-conspirator? The government makes it sinister that he has personal security because obviously he's a high-powered celebrity. Of course, he's going to be one to have a security personnel as staff at his kind of beck and call when needed because he's a high-profile figure. They even, at points, Mark Agnifilo was saying, okay, does Beyonce go to CBS? No, she sends her assistants to go to CBS on her behalf. And so,
and that's a good point she's making. I know these rat bastards and flip-flop wearing and public trolls, they come here and just look for something to complain about. This young lady's doing an excellent job breaking it down, so that's why I'm sitting here listening, but I'm going to explain what they're saying. What they're saying is they taking his assistant going to go get bubble gum and saying that that's a part of the RICO. Taking a assistant to go get baby oil, that's a part of the RICO. Did he use the baby oil to tie him up? Or did he use the baby oil to slipper him up for his kinky behaviors? So it's not anything that's being testified to that could be used. Let me let her go back. She's doing a great job.
Mark Agnifilo was kind of pointing out,
and for you rat bastards that don't know, this is called a reaction video,
that Sean Combs wasn't charged with firearms. He wasn't charged with anything to do with Don Richard. He wasn't charged with the incident with Carrie Morgan with the wooden hanger. He wasn't charged standalone about Cassie's violence and the assault. So Mark Agnifilo was really kind of pointing out in terms of just the security aspect when Cassie was testifying about how she had to hold firearms for Diddy in her purse. Mark Agnifilo said, okay, it was because security gave her the weapons. That's why. And again, kind of pointing to the fact that security is doing what security does for a high profiled individual. That is carry weapons, carry firearms, pointing out that it was legal for them to be carrying these firearms. And even in terms of just Cassie Ventura and the whole Daniel Phillip aspect, and I know we're going to talk more about kind of the sex trafficking part a little towards the end, it's just that Mark Agnifilo kind of pointed out here that Cassie had asked Daniel Phillip to urinate on her in one of these freak-offs. And then kind of towards the end, as he was really kind of getting his final message out to the jury, he says, okay, at what point do you...
Now here it is, someone asking to be urinated on, participated in this type of behavior for 15 years, and they want a jury to pick one incident out of 15 years, which, like I said, they have to be unanimous and specific. This is really interesting.
Stop trusting the government. He says the government targeted Sean Combs because of Cassie's lawsuit. He says that's what makes us different from any other case, especially ones that he has defended, where he says, okay, today you being the jury, are the United States of America. I'm asking you to acquit Sean Combs on all counts and return him to his family who's been waiting for him. And that was his final message, the defense's final message to the jury before, and of course we're going to talk about the prosecution rebuttal a little later, but in terms of just that final message, that's what Mark Agnifilo had to say to those jurors.
Yeah, I know we went a little backwards because I wanted to go to the racketeer because it is the top charge and that's how he ended it. I think it was smart. The last thing the jury hears is about why this is allegedly not racketeering. And I also know that Mark Agnifilo got in trouble because the prosecution called him out for this. They said, he's not allowed to say we targeted Sean Combs. The judge took issue with that, thought that was totally improper, gave a curative instruction to the jury about that as well to basically disregard that comment. You mentioned sex trafficking. Let's go back to it. Why did he argue? How did he argue that what happened to Jane, or what allegedly happened to Jane, what allegedly happened to Cassie Ventura, why is this not sex trafficking? Because I think one thing that, really stood out to me is emphasizing consent and emphasizing their willing participants. But didn't he said something to the effect of, so we're saying this is consensual, this is consensual, this is consensual. And then all of a sudden, not only is this not consensual, this jumps to sex trafficking. That's a wild jump to make. Why was he saying that sex trafficking is not the appropriate charge for Sean Combs when it comes to Cassie or Jane?
Well, I think the main point that the defense was really trying to kind of put in the jury's head is that Sean Combs had no idea that Cassie nor Jane really didn't want to be doing these freak-offs or Wild King nights, hotel nights, whatever you want to call them, but was saying to your point, Jesse, that this isn't sex trafficking because they initially consented. Now, the government kind of bounced back a little bit from that, but in terms of just people kind of understanding sex trafficking as a whole, the government was making it clear that it only takes one instance for him to be found guilty, whereas Mark Agnifilo was like, okay, well, where's the line drawn? If they're doing 75 different freak-offs and 76 is a little different from the first 75, is that make him guilty of sex trafficking? And that was really kind of the message that he was.
Pause right there. That's what I've been saying the whole time. They got 75, 76 different things. And where do they draw the line to know what one they're using out of the 75? And that's where the Supreme Court made it that you had to sit there and list in the verdict sheet what you intend to use as the predicates so that you can see what they picked out of the 75. Just to say that a few out of the 75 was good. This one is good, as Bruce Rivers said. This is good, that's good. Maybe I choose some of that. Maybe I choose some of that. No, but you got to list that. And then all 12 jury have to have a specific conversation about that and then give a whole nother verdict on that. And that verdict is another word for unanimity. Ask Bruce Rivers, very good man, because I don't want nobody to think the last joint was to diss him, but I didn't agree with certain things he said.
Sending to the jury, but in terms of just counts 2 and 4, specifically related to Cassie and Jane, and when it comes to Cassie specifically, Mark Agnifilo is like, okay, I suppose you can sex traffic your girlfriend if you sell her into prostitution. They're swingers. This is a lifestyle. Again, kind of that was a common theme throughout his closing, was that this was just an alternative lifestyle, that these were just swingers, and these were just people who were engaging in threesomes, that they were adults, that they were making these choices. And he kind of said something interesting where he was like, okay, well, if your partner likes anal, but you don't like anal, do you stop doing anal? It was kind of really like an oh my God moment a little bit, because I saw some people in the gallery kind of just be like, what did he just say? But in terms of just Mark Agnifilo kind of painting this as consensual, he was saying that this is what people do who are in love. They do things that maybe they don't necessarily want to do, but they do it because they love their partner, and that doesn't amount to sex trafficking. So when it comes to Cassie, he was saying things like your likes and their likes become one, and Cassie wasn't necessarily clutching her pearls at the ideas of doing freak-offs. And then the defense pointed out those 3 instances that the government alleged were clear instances of sex trafficking. That was what had happened at Cannes Film Festival, something that had happened with Daniel Phillip in 2012 after a freak-off where Cassie Ventura was beaten and then was forced, according to the government, to still do a freak off. And then they point to the Intercontinental Hotel incident. But one thing that was interesting, Jesse, is that they played the Intercontinental Hotel video during the defense's closing argument. And Mark Agnifilo really kind of took it piece by piece. But I think most notably, he skipped the part where Sean Combs is seen on that surveillance video, dragging, beating, kicking Cassie Ventura when she was on the ground. And so in the defense's argument, they were saying that this whole thing was just domestic violence, that this is not sex trafficking. And the defense used one of Cassie's own Instagram posts against her, specifically the one after this CNN surveillance videotape, which we now know to be kind of a snippet of what had happened in 2016 at the Intercontinental Hotel, where Cassie made this post after kind of seeing this amount of support, where she was saying, domestic violence is the issue. Mark Agnifilo kind of pointed it out to be like, okay, she not once said sex trafficking was the issue, none of that. And so it was one of those things where it seemed like the defense was kind of using the alleged victim's words against her. And so then there were other points. So when it came to sex trafficking as it pertains to Jane, Mark Agnifilo says that it's a little bit different than Cassie Ventura Fine, where that Jane had liked all the trappings, that she was more focused on what she was getting out of it that the world could actually see. So seeing the things of them being on social media, those types of things. But then they kind of point to the sex trafficking instances that the government pointed out. So one example was September 2023, where the government claimed that this was an instance of sex trafficking. And the defense showed the jury text messages from this time frame, that being September 18th of 2023, where Jane had liked a text with the link for Cowboys for Angels. The defense says Jane often didn't like the entertainers, and that she was able to kind of send them packing. So they bring out one text message from Jane that we could see in an exhibit where Jane was saying, okay, this is the paymo sent on Venmo for their bum a cowboy, because this cowboy couldn't necessarily perform, or she wasn't attracted to him, something to that effect. And so the defense says that this bum a cowboy was still paid. And then they brought up the then they brought up the sobriety party in October of 2023, where the defense says that Jane was upset about Gina, but she still agreed to do this hotel night. And Mark Agnifilo said people do things because she wanted to do things at the time. Maybe she just regrets it. She agreed to it, and that's pretty much it. And so even in terms of Jane getting her rent paid and those types of things, Mark Agnifilo, again, kind of really he's animated throughout his cross-examination, but at this point, he was saying that Jane previously had a crappy lawyer. Those were literally the words that he had used when it comes to her child support, and that Sean Combs was just doing a nice thing, helping take care of another man's child, providing that child, and then, of course, the child's mother with a nice home, the home that he's still paying for even to this day, even while he's still being incarcerated. And that's about $10,000 a month just on rent alone. And so Mark Agnifilo says that Jane and Sean Combs were kind of into the porn scene, and how Jane even, brought escorts herself and found these escorts herself, specifically naming Cabral and Antoine. And so in kind of the last instance that they were talking about was what had happened June 18th, 19th of just last year. And so Mark Agnifilo said nothing happens this night. They've never been physical before. She slammed his head into the counter. Why did she do this? Without any reasonable explanation at all. The defense saying, why is she calling him that word? And that word being a pedophile, because Sean Combs was dating a 21-year-old. And so the defense was saying that Jane was just trying to get a rise out of him, and that they were pointing out that Jane changed into a dress as opposed to sweats when she was trying to get away, and that Mark Agnifilo claims she wasn't hiding behind a wall for 2 hours, that there's no way that this could have happened. But Agnifilo admits that there was some kind of physical contact that night. He did admit that. He did say that Jane did have visible injuries to her face, something that the jury could see, because unfortunately this was a particular exhibit that we couldn't see. But he says that nothing about this night makes any type of sense. So really kind of putting that reasonable doubt in those jurors' minds, just as it pertains to count 2 and count 4, again, those being sex trafficking in relation to alleged victim 1, that being Cassie Ventura Fine, and alleged victim 2, that of course being Jane Doe.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when he was like, Cassie even called it domestic violence. She didn't call it sex trafficking, that this was all about love. If domestic violence was a charge here, he would have pled guilty to it, that this is all about money. They didn't call 911. They got civil lawyers. I think it was really interesting when he highlighted how Cassie left. Eventually, she left the relationship. She could have always left. What happened to her? Nothing happened to her. Real quick, before we move on to transportation to engage in prostitution, he did spend a little time talking about the underlying predicate crimes of racketeering and the other alleged victims in this case, whether it's Kid Cudi, Mia, Capricorn Clark. Basically said that testimony doesn't support the charges. Real quick, what did he say about those 3 individuals and those underlying predicate crimes, right? Arson, kidnapping, forced labor.
Yeah, so in terms of Kid Cudi, the defense is saying that Cassie played Kid Cudi as something that he being Kid Cudi had even testified to. Mark Agnifilo said the government wants you to believe that she was so scared to death of Sean Combs, but she wasn't afraid of him. Mark Agnifilo claims that Cassie was lying to both Sean Combs and to Kid Cudi because Cassie was trying to keep it gangsta, that she had 2 hotel rooms when Sean Combs had found out that she was seeing Kid Cudi. One was a freak off that they were engaged in around that time frame, but also another hotel room where she had kept this burner phone, and that the burner phone was the reason that she had all these secrets and all of that stuff. And so in terms of just Kid Cudi, the defense really kind of pointing out about the glove that the fire investigator didn't talk about when they showed all those photos to the jury. They were even talking about the female partial DNA that was found, because they have to kind of really emphasize it was partial DNA. It was it kind of matched a female person, but the investigation really stalled in 2011. Nothing really happened. No charges came about from that particular moment. And in terms of Capricorn Clark, the defense spent a lot of time talking about Capricorn Clark, where they had talked about the 2004 alleged kidnapping of her where she was taken to an abandoned building that was going to eventually be turned into one of the bad boy offices, and that she was the government alleges, and Capricorn Clark testified to this too, that she was forced to take these lie detector tests day after day after day after day. And the defense says that it wasn't kidnapping because she was able to go home every single day, that the Capricorn Clark testified that she kept doing it because she wanted to get her job back. And the defense asked the jury at this moment, do you guys feel kidnapped being here inside this courtroom? Because y'all get to go home every day. So again, kind of making it seem a little personal to the jury at some points, but also kind of making it seem like Capricorn Clark, this didn't happen. She wasn't kidnapped because she had the free will to go home every single day. And at any point she could have stopped. But in terms of just the 2011 kidnapping of Capricorn Clark, the defense kind of talked about Capricorn Clark and that she was super platonic friends with Sean Combs, and that they were kind of sprinkling in that Capricorn Clark might have had a crush on Sean Combs. And then even Mark Agnifilo at one point says, okay, well, she's, you know, somewhat of a little off kilter, but really kind of saying that Capricorn Clark had texted Sean Combs that we misused our dope chemistry. But really the defense's main point of this particular argument was kind of just that there was no type of way that Sean Combs had a gun on his person at this time, because why would he have a gun? That was one of the reasons that this might not have even happened. The defense also pointing out that Cassie was the one that gave Sean Combs Kid Cudi's address, and that Sean Combs had everything to lose. So why would he point a gun at one of his staff members and allegedly kidnap her? He also pointed out that Capricorn Clark wouldn't have stayed employed if a gun was actually pulled on her, and that Kid Cudi and Cassie said that Capricorn never said that Sean Combs had a gun. So really kind of planting those seeds of doubt into the jury's mind about whether or not it was a gun. Was it not? But I also think the main thing is, like, do you believe the witnesses? Do you believe what they have to say? Are they all just kind of making this up, or do they all not remember those types of things? And so even in terms of just Nia, really kind of when it falls to RICO and just the underlying predicate acts, they really were talking about the alleged witness tampering, where Mark Agnifilo was saying that the government didn't tell the jury that Mia had sent a message saying that she was out of Skrilla meaning money, and that's why D-Rock had messaged her around that time frame, saying that if you need anything, I might be able to help you. Because, and it's interesting, Jesse, they said that specific line about Mia saying that she was out of Skrilla, because Alexandra Shapiro also used that particular line when they were doing that motion for judgment of acquittal. And so, you know, we were talking about it before on Sidebar a couple days ago. We were like, okay, this might be a preview of what we can expect for the closing argument. And given that those two lines pretty much were exactly the same, it really did feel like, okay, the defense really wanted to make sure that the jury had the full context of why D-Rock might have been reaching out to her.
Yeah. And look, I think there's room for reasonable doubt there. I really do. Now, some might say, is he minimizing too much of this and trying to explain too much of this, even saying things like, oh, it wasn't, you know, bribery, he wasn't trying to tamper with a witness, he was just trying to protect himself, you know, for the underlying crimes. I get it. I don't know where exactly he went with transportation to engage in prostitution. What was the defense to that?
So, Jesse, I really didn't know where the defense was really kind of going to go in that particular argument as it pertains to count 3 and count 5, that being transportation to engage in prostitution. But Mark Agnifilo mentioned that the government only called 2 of the many escorts that were used between the time that Sean Combs was with Cassie over and spilling into the time that Sean Combs was with Jane. And it was a lot of escorts that were shown to the jury just yesterday. And it was really kind of laid out in terms of just even some of the escorts overlapping between Cassie and between Jane. But the government only called 2 of those escorts, that being Daniel Phillips and that being Sheree Hayes, aka the Punisher. And so Mark Agnifilo says that both of these men says that it wasn't sex for money and that they weren't prostitutes. And then they did testify to that. They said that they weren't prostitutes. They said that they were just paid for their time, the experience. But Mark Agnifilo, again, asking, why didn't the government just call more escorts to the stand? And even saying things like, were these the 2 best that they could get? They didn't travel anywhere because they were always here in New York. And so the defense pointed out that Daniel Phillips says that he didn't even ask for a single dollar for spending those nights in the hotel rooms, doing those freak offs with Sean Combs and Cassie Ventura. And even when it comes to Sheree Hayes, aka the Punisher, that Sheree Hayes testified that he goes there to set a sexy scene, and that he went over there one time, got $500, and didn't even have sex with Cassie Ventura. And so Mark Agnifilo said that there's no evidence that there was negotiation of sex for money. And the defense says that the sex videos, these sexually explicit videos of the freak offs, or in some cases, as it comes to, or as it pertains to Jane, that this was just homemade porn, and says that adult film stars, aka porn stars, that they get paid, but they're not prostitutes. So why does that apply to the men that were used in what the defense keeps calling the private time or the personal time when it comes to Sean Combs?
Interesting. So then we come to the rebuttal closing argument from prosecutor Maureen Comey. What were some of the main themes that stood out to you? It was obviously shorter than the first closing argument, but this is the last thing, okay? This is the last opportunity. It's their case, and they have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. What were some of the main highlights from the rebuttal closing from Maureen Comey, the prosecutor?
Well, I will say this, Jesse, that I think AUSA Maureen Comey was a lot more animated and a lot more, I think, direct and personal with the jury, as opposed to Christy Slavic, who really kind of was just, for the most part, she was very methodical, a word that I've been using often describing her, the prosecution's closing argument. But with the rebuttal, Maureen Comey, she was really like, okay, this is my final message to the jury, and I really want you to know this, because she was even using her hands at point. She was kind of saying, the defense wants you to believe that this happened, and this, that was kind of the tone of it. But right off the bat, Maureen Comey says the defense put a whole lot of energy, and she really was kind of exaggerating her words here, where she says they put a whole lot of energy into blaming the victims and the United States government. But the prosecution says in Sean Combs' world, he couldn't take no for an answer. And again, that was a common theme throughout the prosecution's closing argument, even for the first time and then in the rebuttal. And so Maureen Comey mentioned that the burden of proof is on the United States government, and that the defense didn't have to call a single witness, but they welcomed that burden because they believe they proved their case. And so in terms of just some of the biggest highlights, they brought it back to the payment for sex, where Maureen Comey says he wasn't flying escorts all over the country just for their conversation. His money was used for sex, and that Daniel Phillip had testified that he got paid for sex and that he couldn't perform, and that when he couldn't perform, he didn't get any type of money. And so Maureen Comey said that the argument that all the escorts weren't called to testify was just.
Could you imagine Diddy telling this dude, yo, dog, you didn't even get it up. You didn't even phone my girl. You expect to get money? Get out of here. And he's sitting there with his head down and his joint limp between his legs, and he's squabbling out. Diddy said, don't come back. Let's keep this moving.
A distraction. And that Comey said that Sean Combs made Cassie make sure that these men weren't cops. They weren't undercover cops, something that the jury has seen in text messages where somebody had messaged, okay, you're not a cop, right? Those types of things. And so Maureen Comey said the only...
Hold up, she was asking, you're not a cop? And she's not a co-defendant?
Reason to worry about undercover cops is because this is illegal. When it came to count one, that being racketeering conspiracy, Comey says that the uncalled witnesses were equally available to both sides, both the prosecution and both the defense. And so I think kind of trying to imply like, okay, well, if you don't think that these people are co-conspirators, why didn't the defense call them? And she specifically named Christina Quorum and D-Rock. And so Maureen Comey says, you have an enterprise here. The law doesn't require anyone to use the words that they were in a racketeering enterprise. You don't have to come onto the stand and be like, yes, I am a criminal. Yes, I was involved in a member of the racketeering conspiracy. She says you don't need all that. She was saying this to the jury. You don't need all of that in order to prove him guilty on that specific charge. And so even in terms of just the 2011 alleged kidnapping of Capricorn Clark, Comey says that both Cassie and Kid Cudi testified that Capricorn Clark was forced to go over to Kid Cudi's home. The government says that Combs used guns with men, but used fists with women, kind of going back to the Suge Knight incident and going back to just the whole gun aspect of this case. When it came to the London hotel incident with Cassie, the government says it doesn't matter that Cassie wanted to go to Sean Combs' home. She was forced to go to that hotel, that she couldn't even leave even to see her mother. And so, again, pointing to that is proof of kidnapping. When it came to the arson of Kid Cudi's Porsche, the government says that the whole glove thing that the defense was trying to use, where they were like, okay, why isn't the jury shown these photos of the glove or anything like that? Well, the prosecution says that the glove was Kid Cudi's. That's the simplest answer to this. But they also mentioned that Cassie's testimony about Sean Combs specifically threatening to blow up Kid Cudi's car. And then, as we all know, a Molotov cocktail was lodged into that car. And we all know in 2011 what ended up happening. We've seen the photos of it. Kid Cudi had testified to it. Even in terms of just drugs, and the defense was talking about drugs, they were saying it was all for personal use, that this isn't a crime, that again, the assistants were getting Sean Combs drugs because he might have been a drug addict. But at the same time, this isn't criminal, this isn't drug distribution. But the government said no requirement for drugs to be distributed in large quantities, because even I myself thought, okay, drug distribution means that it has to be kilos and lots of drugs, but it really could even come down to personal use drugs. And she said just giving drugs to another person, that is against the law. And she said that the defendant is guilty of racketeering conspiracy because, again, she's not talking about marijuana or anything like that. She's talking about cocaine and ecstasy and GHB, things that were pretty much essential to these hotel nights and freak-offs. And so even in terms of just the hotel nights and freak-offs, Jesse, that Maureen Comey said that Cassie testified that Sean Combs directed the escort to urinate in her mouth, and pointed out that both Cassie and Jane told Sean Combs that they didn't want to be doing these particular nights. Comey even said that there were 3 women who had no motive to lie. It was Cassie, it was Jane, and it was Mia. Cassie, because she had already gotten her settlement. Why does she need to lie? She already has her money. If anything, if she were to get...
She needed to lie, because if she don't lie, then that means that she'll be put on the stand next to him as a co-defendant. Is that a reason?
On the stand and lie, that would just make her look bad. When it came to Jane didn't even file a lawsuit against Sean Combs. And when it came to Mia had already gotten her settlement years earlier. And so I think I think the government are really kind of bringing it all together because they had the last and final word to the jury.
Yeah, the question is, all these people are lying. Really, what is their incentive to lie?
The incentive to lie is that they would wind up being on the case if they don't testify in the manner that they requested to testify. And we're not going to sit here all day. We're not going to play all these games. I sat back. I let her talk because she did an excellent job catching you and me up to speed what's going on. So be on the lookout for the next video. And until then, make sure you subscribe to my daughter's YouTube channel at Juanita Mecca Audio. It ain't that hard. It ain't that complicated.
Cheers, cheers, toast the crime, toast the crime, the crime, the crime, the crime. What?
Fresh out the can of 26, he back on the strip, getting back in the mix. What he mentions a gift. You stand up 10 toes down, and I suggest you pay attention to this. Real. Take a little gully posse and put it in Harlem. He cut from the bottom, came up from the bottom. Drop the book, you should go and get it. The Instagram page and the YouTube, you could go and visit. Then you could consider yourself LinkedIn. Sit front row and get Jews from a kingpin. How he went through it, so you ain't gotta go do it. To not pay attention would be stupid. Talking about a man that probably put your grandfather on. Probably the reason that him and your grams got along. A man that generated millions on the block, did his time, never squilling to the cops, Mecca Audio.
Breaking news, breaking news, breaking news, breaking news. Mecca Audio, Mecca Audio, Mecca Audio.